All eyes turned as the heavy doors of Fairgrove Central Court swung open. A towering black woman stepped inside, wrapped in a charcoal coat, her gaze steady, her silence louder than any outburst. Judge Alan Whitford smirked, gavel poised to crush her dignity with a fine and a public reprimand. But what he didn't know was that he had just picked a fight with Dr. Evelyn Moore, the very woman who once wrote the ethical codes he was about to break. He thought it was just another day of unchecked power. He had no idea he had just lit a fuse that would burn through everything he built. How do you stop a system when the very people who created it are still hiding in the shadows? Before we dive into this gripping story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe silence is no longer an option. Hit like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful truths. All eyes turned as the heavy wooden doors creaked open at the rear of Fairgrove Central Court. A tall, elderly black woman stepped in wrapped in a long charcoal overcoat, a burgundy scarf knotted neatly at her collar. Her gait was steady, unhurried. Her silver-rimmed glasses caught the overhead light, but her eyes calm, discerning, and impossibly clear, never wavered. She made her way down the aisle with the poise of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating rooms designed to make people like her feel small. She sat near the back, hands folded over her lap, saying nothing, yet the silence she carried was louder than any outburst. Judge Alan Whitford looked up from the bench. His gavel paused mid-air, his jaw tensed. "Excuse me," he said sharply, his voice slicing through the murmurs. "Are we now accepting guests in the middle of proceedings? Do we hand out seating charts to latecomers?" The woman did not flinch. She simply looked up at him, her posture straight, composed. "I had a letter from the defense," she replied gently, "requesting my presence for observation." "Observation denied," Whitford snapped. "This is not a lecture hall, Professor. This is my courtroom, and here punctuality is the baseline for respect." A few heads turned. Whispers stirred. Professor Naomi Bell, a young public defender seated beside her client, stiffened, her eyes widened. She knew that voice, that presence, that name, Dr. Evelyn Moore, the woman who had written the textbook on constitutional ethics, the former Harvard law scholar who had for decades taught that the law was only just if wielded with empathy. She was a legend, and Judge Whitford was scolding her like a child. "I will be issuing a fine." Whitford continued, his tone cool and smug. $750 for disrupting this courtroom. Bailiff, make a note." The gallery rustled. For being late. For sitting quietly. Evelyn Moore didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. Instead, with deliberate grace, she reached into her bag, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and counted out the bills one by one. Crisp. Exact $750. She placed the stack on the edge of the defense table without a word. Without looking up, Whitford leaned back, clearly expecting resistance. When he got none, his smirk deepened. "Next case." But before he could finish the sentence, a voice rose from the gallery. "Your Honor." Everyone turned. Naomi Bell stood tall, her charcoal blazer slightly wrinkled from the morning rush, but her eyes clear and unwavering. Her voice didn't tremble. "Before you move on, I believe it's important you know who that is. You just fined." Judge Whitford's brow lifted, his smile flickering. "Oh, enlighten me." Naomi glanced at Evelyn, who hadn't moved. Her eyes remained focused ahead, still silent. "That woman," Naomi said firmly, "is Dr. Evelyn Moore, author of Justice and Equilibrium, former chair of Harvard Law's Department of Legal Ethics, and the woman whose work helped write 3 amendments to state judicial oversight policy. The woman you just fined for entering your courtroom without a bow." A ripple moved through the room. The reporters in the back began scribbling. Court clerks looked up. Even the bailiff hesitated. Whitford's smirk didn't return. Instead, his fingers curled slightly at the edge of his bench. He blinked. And for the first time that morning, it was not the judge who commanded the courtroom, but the woman he had tried to humiliate. Naomi sat back down. Evelyn Moore hadn't said a word since paying the fine, but the silence now belonged to her, and Judge Alan Whitford had no idea what storm had just walked through his doors. The echo of the gavel still hung in the air when Naomi Bell pushed through the crowded corridor of Fairgrove Central Court. Reporters were already murmuring outside. Bailiffs whispered in corners. But Naomi wasn't looking for headlines. She was looking for her Professor Moore. She called, her voice low but urgent. The tall woman paused just outside the courthouse steps, her scarf fluttering slightly in the autumn wind. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. Naomi caught up a little. Breathless. "I'm sorry," Naomi said. "I should have done more in there." Evelyn's eyes softened behind her silver-rimmed glasses. You did what mattered. You stood. That's more than most. Naomi hesitated. I didn't know you were coming. If I had, you weren't supposed to, Evelyn replied calmly. I wasn't planning to either, until I read your letter. Naomi swallowed. Then you saw it. I saw more than what you wrote, Evelyn said. I saw what you couldn't say in writing. They stood in silence for a moment, the courthouse looming behind them like a monolith. There's something off about this place, Naomi said quietly, stepping closer. It's not just Judge Whitford's temper. I've had clients fined $500 for missing hearings. They were never notified about. I've seen plea deals rewritten, mid-process, then sealed. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Sealed, Naomi nodded. And I've been getting pushback. Files that suddenly disappear. Court assignments switched without explanation. And Judge Whitford's courtroom. It's different. Evelyn tilted her head. Different. How Naomi exhaled. Cold mechanical. No space for advocacy. He hands down rulings like he's closing a spreadsheet. There's no discretion, just numbers. And those numbers don't add up. Evelyn looked past her for a moment, watching a young defendant exit with his mother eyes hollow, fine slip in hand. Do you have any of these cases? Evelyn asked. Naomi reached into her leather satchel, pulling out a folded manila envelope. I've been compiling what I can. Nothing conclusive, but patterns, inconsistencies, names that show up too often, and a fund, some sort of reserve that nobody seems to understand. Evelyn took the envelope. Her hands were steady. I haven't practiced in years, she said. I never expected to sit in a courtroom again. But what I saw this morning wasn't justice. It was performance. Punishment dressed in protocol. Naomi's eyes lit up. So you'll help. Evelyn looked down at the papers. I'll look, she said carefully. And if what you suspect is real, then we're not dealing with a bad judge. We're staring into the mouth of something much deeper, something designed. Naomi nodded. I've felt it, like a machine under the floorboards. You don't see it, you just hear the hum. Evelyn's lips curved slightly. Then we follow the hum. They walked together down the courthouse steps, the weight of centuries pressing down from behind, but something new rising between them. Purpose. The kind of quiet resolve that didn't announce itself with shouting, but with footsteps heading back into the storm. That afternoon in the small Beacon Heights apartment where Evelyn now lived, she opened Naomi's file. Her fingers traced familiar codes, outdated regulations, quietly manipulated docket assignments that seemed algorithmic, not human. One record caught her eye, case number 72201B, closed in 2 days, fined $1,200, defendant unrepresented. She leaned back, exhaled slowly and murmured to herself, "This isn't justice, this is arithmetic." Across the city. Judge Whitford sat in his office sipping tea from a porcelain cup, watching a news clip of the morning hearing on mute. His smile was thin, but it never reached his eyes. He had no idea what had just been set in motion. The soft clink of porcelain against oak filled the quiet corners of Evelyn Moore's study. Rain tapped against the windows in gentle rhythm as Naomi sat across the table, her fingers tracing the rim of a ceramic mug she hadn't touched in minutes. In front of them lay an expanding map of court records, audit ledgers, sealed dockets, and legal memos, all pieced together like a jigsaw puzzle from a world that wanted no one to see the whole picture. Evelyn adjusted her reading glasses and glanced at the clock. He should be here by now. Naomi's brow furrowed. You really think he'll come? Before Evelyn could respond, a knock echoed through the hallway, measured, unhurried. She rose and opened the door to reveal a tall, sharp-featured man in his late 30s, dressed in a gray overcoat and a cautious half-smile. A messenger bag hung from his shoulder. "Elias Grant," he said, stepping inside. "I brought the coffee." And the questions. Naomi stood recognizing him from a few public hearings. Assistant District Attorney. Former top of his class, a rising star with a quiet reputation for ethics, in a system that rewarded loyalty over integrity. "You still take it black?" Elias asked, handing Evelyn a cup. "I haven't changed that much," Evelyn replied, motioning toward the table. "But the system has. And I believe you already know that." Elias took a seat, dropping his bag to the floor. "I've been watching the docket shifts. Whitford's court is odd. Cases reassigned at the last minute, fines that triple the city average, and now this equity stabilization fund. It wasn't in last year's ledger. Evelyn slid a document across the table. That's why you're here. I need someone inside. Someone who can follow the paper trail. Naomi leaned forward. We found filings under Judge Whitford's court that all list fine disbursements not to the City General Fund, but to something called the Equity Stabilization Fund, established 18 months ago. On the surface, it's pitched as a support pool for courthouse operations. But Elias took the page, scanning Cornerstone Consulting. He muttered. You've heard of them? Evelyn asked. Elias nodded slowly, not officially, but in whispers. They're a Delaware-registered firm with no physical office, no staff directory, and their legal counsel, Marcus Bellamy, a name that's popped up in 3 separate investigations, all of which ended in quiet settlements and sealed outcomes. Naomi added, Cornerstone receives transfers from the equity fund weekly, sometimes daily, and Whitford signs off on every one. Evelyn tapped a separate sheet. Look here, minor citations, parking violations, loitering, expired tags, funneled through expedited hearings, fined aggressively, then routed straight into Cornerstone's accounts. Elias rubbed his temples. That's not negligence, that's design. They sat in a heavy pause, rain intensifying outside like punctuation. For a moment it felt like the walls were listening. Evelyn broke the silence. This isn't just about financial misconduct. This is coercion at scale, judicial discretion being sold as a commodity. Elias looked between them. If I go any deeper, I put my career on the line. Evelyn's voice was quiet but certain. You were my student once, Elias. You wrote your thesis on prosecutorial integrity. I know you haven't forgotten what that means. He exhaled, then nodded. All right, I'll dig. But we'll need more than speculation. We need names, timestamps, transactions, and we need to move fast. Naomi looked up. Why fast? Elias leaned in, voice lowered. Because if Cornerstone's real, then Whitford's just a gatekeeper, and someone on the other side of that gate is watching everything we do. The storm outside cracked once sharply, and inside that modest beacon, Heights' home, 3 legal minds began building a case not just against a judge, but against a machine. It began with a missing comma. Elias had spent 2 nights poring over sealed case files from Whitford's courtroom, procured through a confidential source at the clerk's office, when he noticed something odd. A transcript from a minor assault case had been redacted and re-uploaded to the public record with subtle edits, a missing line here, a softened phrase there. But what stood out most was a line from the original testimony, one that cast doubt on the victim's identification of the defendant, gone, erased, as if it had never existed. When he brought the findings to Evelyn's study, she read in silence, her eyes moving with surgical precision from one page to the next. They're sanitizing the record, she said finally, removing reasonable doubt, like it's a typo. Naomi, seated nearby, leaned in. That's criminal obstruction. No, Evelyn corrected softly. It's strategic design, and it's happening at scale. Over the next week, the trio uncovered transcript after transcript, 24 cases in total, each bearing signs of quiet manipulation. Defendants coerced into plea deals under the threat of steeper fines or extended detention. Probation violations, exaggerated, witness inconsistencies magically corrected. And behind each altered file, a signature of approval, Judge Alan Whitford. But as they pieced together the inner workings of the scheme, something outside their control began to shift. It started subtly. Naomi's name began appearing in strange online forums, posts accusing her of misconduct, of falsifying records, of coercing her clients. An article surfaced on a fringe blog implying she had once bribed a judge in a traffic case from law school, entirely fabricated, but dressed in enough pseudo-facts to feel real. Evelyn received a letter marked urgent at her doorstep. Inside was a single sentence typed in block font. Your legacy will burn if you keep digging. She didn't flinch, but the next morning her longtime bank called. Her personal account, untouched for years, had been flagged for suspicious activity and was now frozen, pending internal review. No transfers, no withdrawals, she said calmly as she hung up the phone. They're not just watching us, they're cornering us. Naomi's voice was tight with frustration. They're using fear like a crowbar. Online slander. Financial disruption. What's next? Elias answered grimly. Next is violence. If we get too close, and they were getting close, using records from the Equity Stabilization Fund. Elias traced a series of transfers routed through shell entities, many of which linked to Whitford's former campaign staff, now conveniently positioned at nonprofit reform groups across the state. These organizations received hundreds of thousands in discretionary court payments for services never delivered: diversion, counseling, reentry, mentoring, courtroom efficiency audits. They're laundering power through paper, Naomi muttered, and using the court's authority to justify it. The web extended outward far beyond Whitford. Other judges, a city council member, a private prison investor whose name appeared twice on the consulting firm's ledger. "This isn't a rogue operation," Elias said. "It's a doctrine." Evelyn stood, hands clasped behind her back as she stared out the window. The Beacon Heights skyline flickered in the rain-dimmed afternoon light. "We need to go public," Naomi said. "Not yet," Evelyn replied. "If we move too soon, they'll paint us as the conspirators. We need more. We need their own machine to turn on them." A silence fell. Outside, a delivery van idled across the street too long. A man with a ball cap lingered on the sidewalk, checking his phone, though his eyes never left the house. Naomi closed the curtains. The shadow scheme was no longer just a theory. Now it was staring through the window. It was just past midnight when the knock came. Not loud, not urgent, but deliberate. 3 slow raps against the back door of Evelyn Moore's brownstone, measured enough to be intentional, soft enough not to draw attention. Naomi instinctively reached for her phone. Evelyn moved first. She approached with caution, the kind born not of fear, but long-honed instinct. The chain lock stayed on. The door cracked just an inch. A voice whispered, "My name is Reina Ortiz. You don't know me, but I know what you're doing. And I have something you need." Evelyn studied the woman's face. No. Makeup. Rain-wet, hoodie, eyes darting like a hunted animal. "Let her in," Evelyn said calmly. Reina stepped across the threshold, trembling. From the pocket of her coat, she pulled out a black thumb drive wrapped in foil and a rubber band. "I took this from my office. I'm an intern at the district clerk's tech division. We weren't supposed to see sealed files, but sometimes late at night they slip through." This one, she held the drive with both hands. This one was altered, not just sealed. Rewritten, re-logged, and the access credential tied to the edits. She paused, her voice cracking. It was Judge Alan Whitford's. They said nothing at first. Naomi closed the curtains again. Elias, already powering up a secure laptop, motioned for Reina to sit. Within minutes, the files were up on screen. Timestamps, hash histories, version logs, dozens of sealed case documents, minor infractions turned into jail time, testimonies swapped, sentences doubled, and each one bore metadata with the same administrative tag, Whitford A.J. Admin. Naomi's face was pale. "This isn't circumstantial. This is intentional falsification," Elias added, "and it proves judicial tampering. Systemic." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Then slowly she turned and walked to the fireplace. With quiet resolve, she pulled back a narrow panel disguised as molding. Behind it, a switch. She flicked it. Across the room, a bookcase groaned softly and slid open, revealing a narrow tunnel descending into darkness. Naomi stared in disbelief. Elias blinked. Reina said nothing, too overwhelmed to react. "You had an escape route," Naomi whispered. "Old habit," Evelyn said evenly. "There's always a second exit." They barely had time to move. It began with the sound of boots. Heavy, fast, not in the front, but the side entrance. A window shattered in the kitchen, shouts and clipped commands. "Move upstairs." Flashlights swept across walls like search beams. Evelyn grabbed the drive, tucked it into a sealed pouch, and slipped it inside her coat. Elias snatched the laptop. Naomi steadied Reina, guiding her toward the opening in the wall. As they entered the tunnel, Evelyn glanced back once, just long enough to see the living room lights flare as masked men burst through the front. They descended in silence. The tunnel sloped under the alley, lined with reinforced brick and pipework. Evelyn had paid to retrofit years ago during a different storm, a different threat. When they emerged into the cold rain of the side alley, Reina gasped for air. Naomi looked back toward the house. Smoke. They torched it. Elias said, his voice hollow. The brownstone that had held decades of lectures, letters, case law, and memory gone. But the drive was safe, and with it the proof. Evelyn stared at the rising smoke, her face unreadable. "This was never about me," she said quietly. "It's about who they fear we might reach." Naomi nodded, soaked and breathless. "Then let's make sure they're right." They spent the next morning in a borrowed back room of a closed bookstore, the only place Evelyn trusted after the raid. Rain still tapped against the window panes like a ticking clock. Naomi hunched over a laptop with red-rimmed eyes. Elias scrolled through spreadsheets and Raina, her hands still shaky, sorted the remaining sealed files they had managed to download before the power went out. Evelyn stood quietly by the window watching the morning light struggle through the clouds. The metadata on these transcripts, Elias said, doesn't just link to Whitford. He turned the screen toward them. There's another name buried in the administrative backend. Vaughn, PR admin, logged as an outside consultant on over half the modified documents. Naomi narrowed her eyes. Preston Vaughn. Elias nodded slowly. Same. Preston Vaughn, who co-founded Cornerstone Consulting, the firm managing the Equity Stabilization Fund. Naomi's jaw tightened. He's not just enabling the scheme. He built it. Raina, finally finding her voice, whispered, Preston Vaughn. Wasn't he a former advisor to the governor and a donor to 3 judicial campaigns? Evelyn added, including Whitford's. She walked to the table and unrolled a case ledger Naomi had printed out weeks ago, one she had assumed was incomplete, but now the gaps made sense. Whitford's decisions weren't random or personal. They were scripted. The excessive fines, the sealed hearings, the diverted settlements, it had all followed a design. A system calibrated for silence, compliance, and profit. And behind it, not a rogue judge, but a strategist, a political architect, Preston Vaughn, a man whose name never appeared in headlines but always in the margins. He's been 3 steps ahead, Elias said. He didn't just connect the dots, he laid them down. Raina tapped the edge of her mug. So what now? He's too powerful to drag out into the light. Everyone who's tried before has disappeared or been ruined. Evelyn didn't blink. Then we don't drag him. We unmask him, piece by piece, publicly, precisely, relentlessly. Naomi looked between them. How Evelyn turned to Elias. Did you say he was listed as a consultant? Elias nodded. On record. Yes, for the Efficiency Fund and for 2 advisory committees at the State Bar. Then he left fingerprints. She pulled out a folder she had tucked beneath her coat. Inside, handwritten notes, archived emails from her time at the State Ethics Board, and 2 signed policy memos, each one citing a mysterious compliance liaison by the initials PV. He's been weaving this for years, she said, but in his precision he left patterns. They cross-referenced client lists from Cornerstone, consulting with court calendars. They matched fund disbursements with plea bargain spikes, and they found the loop. Funds channeled into court innovation grants then funneled back through shell firms tied to Vaughn's personal PACs. It wasn't just a racket. It was a laundering scheme dressed in policy, cloaked in reform, and fueled by fear. By sunset, the room was covered in papers. Highlighters, diagrams, names circled and underlined. Whitford was merely a puppet. Preston, Vaughn was the hand. And now that hand was shaking because someone was finally watching. Evelyn leaned over the table, her voice even. If we release everything at once, it will be noise. But if we reveal the structure, the design, and tie every thread back to him, Naomi finished her thought. It becomes undeniable and unforgivable, Elias added. They looked at each other, tired but burning with clarity. The machine had a maker, and it was time to tear it down. The wind over Arkbridge felt heavier that night. In a quiet apartment above a closed bike repair shop, the dim glow of a half-dozen laptops lit the faces of 3 people who were about to change the trajectory of a city. Evelyn Moore sat at the head of a long, battered work table, her posture calm, but her eyes sharp. Naomi Bell typed with the focused rhythm of someone who had stopped feeling fear and started feeling fire. And between them was a 4th chair occupied by Myra Chen, civil rights technologist, hacker system disruptor. She wore an oversized hoodie that read "Protect the Truth" and a pair of wireless headphones slung around her neck. Her fingers danced over the keyboard like a pianist mid-concerto. I've built a distribution cascade, Myra said without looking up. 37 independent media outlets, 6 university law blogs, 12 whistleblower subreddits, all staggered across time zones, languages, and platforms. Once I trigger the drop, it can't be stopped. Not even if the entire state firewall goes down. Naomi stared at the monitor. What about the metadata? Scrubbed, time-stamped, hashed. Every file signed with your names and Evelyn's personal archive signature. It's not anonymous. Good, Evelyn said. This isn't a rumor. It's a reckoning. The drive Raina had stolen, the whistleblower records, the forensic audit of Cornerstone Consulting, financial trails linking the Equity Stabilization Fund to PACs and shell firms tied to Preston Vaughn, redacted court files now recompiled and verified. It wasn't just a scandal. It was evidence of engineering a justice system quietly reprogrammed to serve power instead of people. "And the visualization overlays?" Evelyn asked. Myra grinned. "Every transfer, every plea deal, every altered transcript animated in a living map. If someone tries to deny it, we'll make them look like they're lying in 4K. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Naomi turned to Evelyn. "Are we ready?" Evelyn looked at the room, at what it represented. Generations of silence, broken lives, rigged courts. And now finally a strike bold enough to shake the scaffolding. She nodded once. "Drop it." Myra's finger hovered for a beat, then tapped enter. Across the internet, a digital wave crashed through firewalls, subscriptions, and algorithms. Headlines bloomed like wildfires. Judges for profit, the Arkbridge scandal. Cornerstone Consulting accused of judicial laundering. The Langston files go public and the fallout begins. It trended within minutes. Journalists scrambled, law students wept. Victims reposted their stories, suddenly not alone. TikToks broke down corruption maps. Podcasts went live. National civil rights groups retweeted it with a single caption: "This is why trust fractures." By sunrise, Judge Alan Whitford's courtroom sat eerily quiet. No gallery chatter, no performance, just silence wrapped in suspicion. At 9:03 a.m., the State Judicial Review Board issued an emergency summons, an evidentiary hearing. Whitford had 36 hours to respond, and for the first time in his long, unchallenged tenure, he wasn't calling the shots. Back in the apartment, Evelyn stood near the window watching headlines update in real time. Naomi turned from the screen. "We just lit a fuse, didn't we?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "No, we just gave the fire its name, and across Arkbridge, from courtrooms to coffee shops, people began whispering it. Whitford, Vaughn, Cornerstone, Langston. The walls of power had cracked, and truth impossible to unsee had finally stepped into the light. The crowd outside the Arkbridge State Judicial Building stretched around the block by 7:00 a.m. Camera crews, protesters, law students gripping case printouts, retired judges in silence, former defendants holding signs that read, "We remember the fines." Inside the marble-floored courtroom had never held this many eyes, not for a murder trial, not for a mayor's indictment. This was different. This was a reckoning. Judge Alan Whitford sat at the defense table, not the bench. For the first time in 2 decades, his robe was folded neatly at his side, not draped across his shoulders. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed forward. At the front of the room, seated behind a modest oak table, was Dr. Evelyn Moore, gray scarf, wire-rimmed glasses, composed as ever. But this time she wasn't an accused. She wasn't a guest. She was the witness. The proceedings began at 9:15 sharp. Presiding over the hearing was Judge Lorraine Beckett, a federal appointee with a reputation for exacting precision and no tolerance for drama. "Dr. Moore," she began, "you may proceed with your statement." Evelyn rose slowly, her voice calm but firm. "For decades, I believed the law could correct itself, that sunlight, if given enough time, would always pierce the rot. I was wrong." She glanced toward the gallery, toward Naomi, Elias, and the rows of strangers now listening like students in her old lecture hall. "I'm here because silence has cost this city too much." Judge Whitford did not merely administer justice, he repurposed it, monetized it, and when he was challenged, he retaliated. She opened a folder and passed it to the clerk. "These are the original and altered court transcripts, all authenticated, all showing evidence deliberately redacted under Judge Whitford's digital credentials." A murmur stirred the room. Next, Naomi stepped forward, confidence steeled. "Your Honor, we've compiled 19 cases where the redactions weren't clerical. They were targeted. In each one, exculpatory testimony was removed or altered. In every one, the ruling favored the prosecution and fed funds into the equity stabilization pipeline." She tapped a laptop. A split screen of 2 files appeared on the projector. One bore a full witness statement, the other a version with a single damaging paragraph removed. Same case, same date. 2 versions. Shock spread like static. Then Elias Grant took the floor. "I'm Assistant District Attorney." "Elias Grant," he said, his voice tight with restraint. 3 months ago, I discovered a series of internal memos, flagged reports of irregular sentencing patterns, plea deals rejected without cause, and directives from Cornerstone Consulting to manipulate fine collection. He handed the documents to the panel. Those warnings were ignored because Whitford wasn't working alone. That's when the mood shifted. All eyes turned to Judge Whitford, who sat motionless but not silent. With a slow breath he stood. "Since everyone here's so eager for truth," he said, his voice laced with bitterness, "let me offer some. You think I dreamed this up alone? You think one judge could build all this?" He turned to face Judge Beckett. "This entire courthouse knew. The board knew. Preston, Vaughn knew, hell. Some of your own staff in the oversight committee nodded and smiled while we built the machine." Gasps rippled through the room. Whitford stepped closer to the mic, his expression somewhere between pride and rage. "I did what I was told, and I did it well, because the people funding your elections wanted numbers, not fairness." Silence hung in the air like smoke. Then Judge Beckett's gavel cracked once, sharper than thunder. "Enough," she said, her voice a razor. "This hearing is not finished, but the silence that ends today." In the back row, Naomi whispered, "He just tore the curtain down." Evelyn didn't smile. She just nodded. The web had broken, and the air finally tasted like truth. It was the most watched courtroom decision in Arkbridge history. By sunrise, the courthouse steps were crowded, cameras lining the walkway like sentries, reporters murmuring facts over hot microphones, citizens clutching signs that read, "Fines aren't justice and system rigged, system falls." Inside the gallery was standing room only Dr. Evelyn Moore sat at the prosecution table, her hands folded in quiet resolve. Beside her, Naomi Bell sat upright, her eyes fixed ahead, jaw tight. Elias Grant flanked them, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if bracing for impact. At the defense table, Judge Alan Whitford was no longer draped in authority. He wore a simple navy suit, but the posture was still there, chin high back unbending like a man convinced the court was still his. He had barely spoken since the evidentiary hearing, but no one forgot his words. "I wasn't working alone." The clerk stood, voice slightly strained beneath the weight of what was coming. In the matter of the state of Massachusetts versus Alan Whitford on the charges of judicial misconduct, falsification of court records, abuse of power, and conspiracy to defraud, we the jury find the defendant guilty on all counts. Gasps scattered through the courtroom. Naomi's breath caught. Elias exhaled sharp like he'd been holding it for weeks, but Evelyn remained still. Only her eyes flickered with something between vindication and something else. Caution. The judge presiding over the trial, Justice Lorraine Beckett, spoke clearly. "Sentencing will be held in 30 days. In the meantime, the defendant will be remanded into federal custody with no bail." Two U.S. Marshals moved toward Whitford. The room watched in stunned silence as they placed cuffs around the wrists of a man who had once ruled this very courtroom with unchecked authority. He didn't resist, but as the metal snapped shut, Alan Whitford smiled. It wasn't pride, it wasn't defiance. It was something far more unsettling. It was knowing. He turned slightly, scanning the gallery until his eyes met Evelyn Moore's. The grin curled, not wide, not theatrical, but surgical. "I told you," he said softly, almost too soft for the mics to catch, "I was never the architect." And then he was led away, down the aisle, past the reporters, past the posters, into the back corridor, swallowed by the system he once controlled. Outside, the city stirred with celebration. Headlines exploded. "Whitford guilty, corruption, exposed, Arkbridge turns a page." But inside Evelyn's chest, the knot didn't loosen, not yet. Because just as the court adjourned, Naomi's phone buzzed with a message. One line from a secure number, "Reina Ortiz has disappeared." Her heart sank. "No," she whispered. Reina, the whistleblower who'd risked everything to deliver the thumb drive, the one person outside the legal world who had taken their fight personally. She was gone. No trace, no calls, no signal. Across town at the edge of the financial district, a black SUV idled outside an underground parking garage. Inside sat a man with salt-gray temples and a phone pressed to his ear. "Whitford was always disposable," he said calmly. "This changes nothing." His name: Preston Vaughn, architect, operator, ghost, and the machine. It was still humming. Naomi looked at Evelyn. "We're not finished." Evelyn nodded, eyes steady. "No," she said. "We've just touched the surface." The fall of Judge Alan Whitford shook Arkbridge, but the dust didn't settle, it shifted. In the weeks following the verdict, some headlines faded, news cycles moved on. But for those who had lived the war, there was no return to before. Not when the root was still alive. Dr. Evelyn Moore sat beneath the tall windows of her Beacon Crest study, the morning sun casting sharp golden slats across the floor. Her scarf, deep maroon, today hung neatly over one shoulder, and a slim file rested in her lap. Across the room, Naomi Bell and Elias Grant sifted through case files, grant proposals, and maps of the Arkbridge Judicial Circuit. They were building something. Not a law firm, not a protest movement, something that could last. The Moore Initiative. Part legal watchdog, part reform engine. It had one purpose: dismantle the mechanisms that made corruption not only possible, but profitable. Its first mission: create a database of sealed court records, questionable fund allocations, and judicial ethics reports. Every name that had once whispered power in closed chambers would now be traceable. Accountability had arrived. Naomi leaned over a printout. We've already got requests from 6 counties asking for auditing help. Some of them are scared. Some are just relieved. Evelyn nodded slowly. Relief is the start. But reform takes stamina. We're not here to celebrate. We're here to endure. She opened the folder in her lap. Inside a list of donors, some familiar, others quietly influential, who had reached out in support after the verdict. Former Students' Foundations, retired judges who had long kept their heads down. One name had written only 3 words beside a check. We were waiting, but not everyone had welcomed their return. That morning, Evelyn had received a package. No postmark, no return address. Inside a single page, no threats, no demands. Just one sentence printed in sharp black ink across the center. The tree still grows. Evelyn folded it carefully and slipped it into a leather-bound case marked Whitford, Phase 2. She smiled. It wasn't amusement. It was understanding. Because whoever sent that message misunderstood one thing. The tree did still grow, but so did they. Naomi turned toward the window. Outside, college students passed with coffee cups and tote bags. A mural was being painted on the side of the courthouse, a pair of hands breaking chains beneath a rising sun. Beside it, someone had scrawled in bright blue, "Justice is not given, it's organized." Elias tapped his pen against the desk. There's still no trace of Preston Vaughn. No trail. He's pulled everything offline. The DOJ says they're close, but his voice trailed off. Evelyn didn't blink. He's watching, and he's waiting to see if we run out of steam. Naomi shook her head. He'll be disappointed. At dusk, the 3 of them stood before a modest sign just installed on a building near City Square Park. Simple lettering. No gold, no marble. The Moore Initiative for Transparent Justice. As the wind shifted through the streets of Arkbridge, Evelyn glanced upward. Somewhere in the distance, behind corporate glass and curtained meetings, the old networks were still moving, plotting, preserving, surviving, but this time they weren't unopposed. They weren't unobserved. She turned to Naomi and Elias. "Let them grow their tree," she said softly. "We're building roots." And with that, they stepped inside not to end the fight, but to carry it forward, because now the system knew they weren't going anywhere. The courtroom may have handed down a verdict, but the war for justice, that's just getting started. Because people like Judge Whitford may fall, but the ones behind him, the ones who built the system to shield men like him, they're still out there. And that's why Evelyn Moore, Naomi Bell, and Elias Grant didn't walk away. They built something bigger, the Moore Initiative. A watchdog coalition that won't just expose corruption, it'll prevent it. And maybe that's what scared them the most. Not the scandal, but the silence that finally broke. If this story moved you, if you believe that the law should protect people, not exploit them, hit that like button to push this truth further. Comment. I stand with Evelyn if you're ready to fight back, and don't forget to subscribe because there are more stories like this and you deserve to hear every single one. We're just getting started, and so are they.